thank you everyone for being here, and thanks for this invitation. And I'm very honored and pleased to be here. I'm hearing an echo of myself. This is a little bit difficult. Okay, yeah, that's better. That's better. Okay, good. Okay, so what I'll try to do here is to say a few words about the history of fossil fuels in our world economy as I see it, and then segue into problems concerning the present transition, if we will indeed have one. So, my original interest in the question of fossil fuels was historical. I wanted to investigate the first transition into fossil fuels. You know that before humanity used fossil fuels, of course, we used energy resources that would today be classified as renewables. So a question you could ask is, why did people start using fossil fuels in the first place on a large scale? And when you ask this question, of course, what you're primarily concerned with is the problem we're having in the present of a deep structural dependency on fossil fuels in our economies that creates a lot of problems. The most notable of which is obviously global warming, which is about to reach catastrophic levels, and I'll come back to that soon. But the question then is basically, how did we get caught up in this mess? How did we become so dependent on fossil fuels in the first place? And when you ask this question, there is one place you have to look at, and that place is Britain. There is no doubt that Britain was the first country that developed the phenomenon of large-scale fossil fuel production. And what this means is large-scale production of coal, because coal was the first fossil fuel. Oil and gas came later. So I wanted to investigate why Britain shifted into fossil fuels, and more particularly, why the cotton industry, which was the spearhead of the Industrial Revolution, made this turn. Before coal, the British cotton industry used water power, so water wheels. This was before electricity, so these were water wheels that ran in rivers and other streams, and you built factories powered by these wheels. At a certain point, the owners of mills and factories in the British cotton industry decided to forego this old emissions-free, what we would today call renewable energy source, and shift to another one, namely steam power. So steam engines that powered cotton production where it had previously been powered by water wheels. And steam engines, of course, were fed by the fuel of coal extracted from mines in Britain and burned under the boilers of the steam engines. So this shift marked a major transition into dependency on a fossil fuel for the production of commodities. Now, the traditional conception of this transition is that water was scarce and expensive, and that's why a shift to coal happened. Coal was abundant and cheap. However, this turns out not to be the case. Steam power was, in fact, more expensive throughout this transition, and there was no scarcity of water. So you had a situation where renewables were cheaper and abundant, but still a shift happened into steam power and coal. And the reason why steam power was more expensive is quite easy to see. To get coal out of the ground, you need a lot of labor. You need people to go into the mines and dig up the coal and take it up to the surface. And this means that coal is a commodity that fetches a price on the market. It has exchange value because there's a lot of labor put into it. water runs in a stream for free, spontaneously, naturally. There's no labor required to get the water to run in the river. This happens by itself. So therefore, water was cheaper all the way through the transition. However, there was a great advantage of coal and steam power, and it was mobility in space. So this was before electricity, as I said, before electrical transmission. We're talking here about the early 19th century in Britain. And water mills could be built. The water was available. It was cheap, but you had to build a water mill on the spot where the water ran in the stream. And water, as every other renewable source of energy, or what you could call flow, is attached to particular sites in the landscape. So water runs in a stream. You can't find it anywhere. With coal, it's very different. Coal is under the ground, but once you've dug it up and you have it in pieces, you can move it anywhere. And the great advantage for the capitalists of this period was that it liberated them in space. So with steam powered production, you could build your factories basically anywhere, regardless of where the energy source was located, because as soon as the coal had been taken above ground, it could be transported to any site. So these steam-powered factories could be built in the cities where you had a lot of labor power available, and banks and markets, and you could detach the site of production from the site of energy production. Are you following me? Yeah, I hope so. This accorded a new level of abstract space to capitalist production, in the sense that it unfettered the process of industrial location from the sites of the energy sources. And this is a very crucial aspect of the whole problem of the fossil economy. With fossil fuels, as soon as you've taken them underground, you can ship them and transport them basically anywhere in the world. And the situation that you have in this country is to an extent the most extreme instantiation or manifestation of this type of abstract space, because the coal that you have been producing here in this part of Colombia for, as I understand it, about 4 decades now, is of course not primarily used here. 90% of it is exported, and it's sent anywhere in the world. So you can take up coal in the mines in Colombia and sell this coal and send it to Turkey or Israel or Sweden, where I live, or basically anywhere in the world. With renewables, it doesn't work that way. Even in the era of electrical transmission, it's impossible to produce solar and wind as a commodity in Colombia and then dispatch and sell a piece of sun or wind in Turkey or Israel and Sweden. The flow of energy is still tied to particular sites in the landscape and cannot be turned into a commodity that can be traded globally in the way that fossil fuels can. Are you following the argument? Yeah. This was a major reason for the transition into fossil fuels. So fossil fuels created a new kind of freedom in space for capital. And this was a process very much related at the very beginning to colonial relations, or to the politics of empire. So Britain at this point was, of course, the main empire of the world in the 19th century. It used coal from its own mines, so it didn't import the coal. This is important to understand historical shifts here, but it used coal from its own mines to gain a great freedom in space and project more power across the world. And a key technology here was the steamboat. I'm just going to digress very briefly into a few comments on the Middle East, which is the part of the world outside of my own part, Northern Europe, that I know something about. I should say that this is not only my first visit to Colombia, but it's my first visit to Latin America. So this is a part of the world that I know very little about, but I know a little bit about the Middle East, where I've spent some time. And the Middle East today, as you know, is the part of the global south that is the focus of the most intense imperial aggression. And we can think of two countries in particular that are suffering sustained violence from the West. I'm thinking of Palestine and Yemen. So Yemen is being bombed on a daily basis by the US, sometimes with the help of the UK. Part of Yemen was first colonized in 1839 when the British took the port town of Aden to use it as a coaling port where coal could be stored so that steamships could travel between Britain and India and elsewhere. So to enact this freedom in space that steamships accorded, there was a need for coaling stations, and the British found that we have to occupy parts of Yemen to create this basis for our freedom in space. Then I'm not going to go into the history of Yemen, but for 2 centuries, Yemen has been in various ways subordinated by the empire. For Palestine, there's a very similar picture. In Palestine, we have now had a genocide going on for a year and a half. And the process of Western subjugation of Palestine started in 1840, when the British for the first time used steamboats in a major warfare. And they used these boats to bomb particularly the Palestinian town of Akka, which they destroyed completely. And this was also the moment in time when the idea came up in the top echelons of the British Empire to colonize Palestine and give the country to Jews to be relocated from Europe into Palestine and serve as a basis of Western interests. I'm going very fast here. I recently published a book called The Destruction of Palestine is the Destruction of the Earth that deals with this in a little bit more detail. But ever since then, ever since 1840, we've had a structure in Palestine where the colonization of that country is powered by a full integration of the occupation entity in the circuits of fossil energy. And this entity, this occupation, being fully linked to Western powers. So the occupation has unlimited access to oil and gas and coal supplied by various countries. In terms of oil, the main supplier is still British Petroleum, taking oil from Azerbaijan and sending it to the ports in the 1948 areas in what is known as the State of Israel. As for coal, as you might know, this country has been the main supplier of coal to the State of Israel. And of the many unique things that are going on in this country, it's very important, in my view, that your government has announced that it's no longer allowing shipments of coal to the occupation. And this government has announced its support for a kind of energy boycott to bring the genocide to an end. Now, there are problems with this boycott, but I'll come back to that later. The point here, and I'm going very fast, as I said, is that the expansion of the fossil economy out from Britain was a process of imperial violence from the very beginning that is continuing into this day, most intensely in the Middle East. And of course, this is related to the role of the Middle East as the main heartland of oil and gas in the contemporary world, up until very recent, when the US overtook the Middle East as the main oil and gas producing country. I think there's a similar history here that I don't know, but my understanding is that steamboats were crucial to the opening up of the Magdalena River and the exploitation of the natural resources of this country in the middle of the 19th century. This was a global pattern where the relation between colonial peripheries and the metropolis was solidified by the help of steamboats, carrying natural resources from peripheries back into the imperial core, and thereby consolidating an extractive relation that has been in place ever since, and is very conspicuous in this particular country. Okay, so this kind of historical research that I've tried to do is focused on the original, like I said, shift into fossil fuels, and how this process is then continued up until the present. And to jump from the middle of the 19th century straight into the present, 2025, what we're seeing right now is in a way similar to the original transition, in that we have a situation where renewables today, not water, but solar and wind, are cheaper than fossil fuels and abundant and technologically available. But we are actually seeing investment on a global level still continuing to prioritize fossil fuels. So if you look at the world as a whole, the general trend is that private capital keeps giving primacy to fossil fuels, despite them being generally more expensive for producing electricity, at least, and despite the emerging abundance of solar and wind. And the reason for that is that you can generate much more profit from fossil fuels. And this became particularly evident, ironically, in 2022, the year when you elected this Petro government, when there was an unprecedented profit bonanza in the fossil fuel industries, where companies in the business of producing fossil fuels earned the greatest profits that they had ever made. And this triggered a kind of frenzy for fossil fuel production from Saudi Arabia to the US to Norway to Australia and elsewhere, where banks and asset managers and private energy companies started to reduce their commitment to investing in renewables and instead double down on investment in oil and gas in particular, but also coal in certain places. So paradoxically, we're seeing a similar situation as in the original transition, although here the key factor is that the producers of energy, of oil and gas, give priority to continuing with business as usual, because these fuels can be turned into commodities and sold on the market. And with the inherent price volatility of oil and gas in particular, there are a lot of opportunities for super profits. So, for instance, what happened in 2022 was, of course, that there was the invasion of Ukraine that unsettled the energy markets and drove up prices. And the oil and gas companies that had managed to cut their costs of production in various ways then earned super profits in a way that it is impossible to do with renewables, because there's no labor that goes into their production, and they're not traded globally. So they're not subject to these price swings and cannot generate anywhere near the profits of fossil fuels. So unfortunately, what we're seeing in the world as a whole today is not an energy transition. We're seeing build up, scaling up of renewable energy capacity in the world, but this is on top of a growing cake of fossil fuel production. And the ultimate problem here is, of course, how this affects the climate system of the Earth. And we have to remember that for the climate system, it doesn't matter how many new solar panels or wind turbines you build if you also keep digging up oil and gas and coal and setting them on fire. What we're seeing generally in the world, with exceptions here and there, is a process of energy addition where you add renewables on top of fossil fuels. But a transition means something else. It means phasing down fossil fuels, taking them out of the economy and replacing them with other sources of energy from the flow. What's pretty exceptional about Colombia in this particular period is that it has announced an aspiration to actually execute a real transition. And this is remarkable in a lot of respects. One of them is, of course, that Colombia, due to its insertion into the world economy as a periphery subjected to extractivism, producing raw materials for sale on the global market, that means primarily export to the north, is structurally dependent on fossil fuel production for a very large part of its export revenues and everything that comes with that, employment and everything. There are rich countries in the global north that produce much more fossil fuels, but are less structurally dependent on them because they are advanced, diversified economies. So if you look at Norway or the US or the UK or Canada or Australia, these countries that are now most aggressively expanding fossil fuel production, they have some of the most affluent economies in the world, with a lot of manufacturing activities and services and digital technology and all these things that would make it relatively easy for them to phase out fossil fuels because they don't depend on them for something like half of their export revenues as you do. However, this is not what's happening. As I said, these countries are doing everything to accelerate fossil fuel production. So Norway, the country next to Sweden where I live, is the largest oil and gas producer in Europe. And they are in Norway planning for maybe a century of maximizing oil and gas production. And they're very explicit that they're going to try to take out every last drop and locate it and find it and get it out of the ground. And the Norwegian government is continuously showering the industry in new exploration licenses. In the US, we have a peculiar situation where, since Obama oversaw the fracking boom, this country has surged into the world's leading producer of oil and gas. And this surge sped up during the 4 years of the Biden administration. So this was a typical case of energy addition, not transition. The Biden administration did nothing to transition away from fossil fuels. Instead, it oversaw a continuous expansion of oil and gas production. Coal was going down, but oil and gas just continued to boom and was exported in ever larger quantities. And more licenses for exploration and extraction were handed out. Now, with the second Trump presidency, this is taken to an even higher level of intensity, where Trump is removing every last obstacle to fossil fuel production, and he's opening Alaska for exploration and extraction. He is speeding up permits for new pipelines. He is even making it more difficult to build solar panels and wind turbines. He hates wind in particular, as the far right does everywhere. So the politics that he is trying to pursue is a kind of a counter transition. So stop the expansion of renewables, but increase the expansion of fossil fuels. This is what the most powerful economy in the world is doing right now. And of course, this will have repercussions in other parts of the world as well. And you see other countries already moving along this path. What is so particularly disastrous about this happening at this moment is that we are, as you might know, we are crossing the threshold of 1.5 degrees of global warming. This is the threshold that was specified in the Paris Agreement in 2015 as the one that must not be crossed. This was later confirmed by the special report on 1.5 degrees from the IPCC in 2018, which laid out, and we know much more about this since this report came out, the dangers of crossing this threshold. Last year, average temperatures on Earth were 1.55 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline. This was the first year, 2024 was the first year when warming exceeded 1.5 degrees. And the warming that's going on right now is extremely fast, so fast that scientists are struggling to comprehend how it can be this fast because it doesn't fit their models. And one of the great dangers of this is that we have a cluster of tipping points in various subsystems of the climate system located between 1.5 and 2 degrees of global warming. And to just mention one of them that is close in space to where we are right now, the Amazon has a tipping point where this ecosystem can flip from being a rainforest into being something more like a savanna, with dry scrubland and scattered forests and even sand deserts. Because, you know, the rainforest is a self-sustaining ecosystem where the trees produce water vapor that is recycled and that keeps the forest intact. But once enough trees start drying out and die, this recycling process goes into reverse gear, and there is a deficit of moisture in the system. That means that more trees dry out and more trees then die, and so on and so forth. And at a particular point, the rainforest starts developing into a completely different kind of ecosystem. And what's happening in the Amazon right now, and this is particularly intense in the southeast, so not in the Colombian rainforest, but in the southeast, so in Brazil. That's the edge of these processes. We have a very intense process of drying out. The Amazon in general experienced its worst drought ever last year, with the water levels in the Amazon River hitting the lowest levels ever recorded. And the scientific consensus, if you read the peer-reviewed literature on this, is that the Amazon is virtually perched on the tipping point now as we speak. And if previously scientists had thought that maybe 4 degrees of warming would cause this flip, now the general perception is that the flip, the tipping point, is somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And the loss of the Amazon, its transformation into a savanna, which would be most intense in the southeast, but which could then spread into other parts of the Amazon as well, would of course be a completely devastating destruction of the ecology of this continent and the world as a whole, because of all the carbon that is held in the rainforest that would be emitted. I mean, it's difficult. It's a mind-boggling thought that the Amazon, which has been there as a rainforest for 60 million years, would cease to exist, right? But this is the kind of near future that we're facing if we continue to pour out CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's similar with a lot of other subsystems, the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, the permafrost, boreal forests, and so on and so forth. Most of these tipping points are located between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And right at this moment, Donald Trump and other world leaders are not slowing down, but speeding up the extraction of fossil fuels. And at a global perspective, to zoom out from your particular challenges and dilemmas in the economy of Colombia, what's so magnificently important about what you've been doing here since 2022 is that you, as a fossil fuel producing country, have defended the idea that fossil fuels can actually be left in the ground and that we can shift to other forms of energy production. And here, of course, I'm thinking about the decisions to stop the licensing of new exploration for oil and gas, and to stop fracking, and to try to also stop coal mining, new opening of mines. And there, yeah, also things, of course, like removing subsidies on gasoline, but in particular, the policy for terminating new fossil fuel installations, which is of the absolute essence here. And after the Paris Agreement, and when the world committed itself to capping global warming at 1.5 degrees, the essential policy for doing this was identified as precisely no new oil fields, gas fields, coal mines, pipelines, terminals, coal-fired power plants, etc. Because the particular problem of opening new installations is that when you do so, you sink capital into these installations. And because they are very expensive to establish and open, there is an interest in keeping them going for a long time to recuperate the original investments and to make sure that these projects yield a profit. This is something that my colleague Wim Carton and I wrote about at length in a book that came out last year called Overshoot: How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown. We analyze precisely the logic of investment in new fixed capital in oil fields, gas fields, mines, etc., and how this investment creates a deep inertia in the system, an entrenched interest from capital in keeping business as usual going. And the more new installations you open, the deeper that inertia becomes. Because, for instance, when Norway opened Johan Sverdrup in 2019, the largest oil field in Europe, that created a deep interest in keeping the field running for many, many, many decades. If that oil field that was open in 2019 had been closed in 2020, it would have implied a massive loss for the investors, because all the capital that had been poured into that oil field would have been lost if it had been closed after only a year. It requires decades for an investment like that to yield its potential profits, to recuperate the original investment, but also to yield its potential profit. That's why it's so incredibly important to stop the opening of new projects, and therefore it's so symbolically important that this country announced a stop to exploration for new oil and gas, which is the exact opposite of what countries like the US and Norway are doing. Now, because of this situation in the world, where we have global warming running amok, out of control, and we have these emerging breakdowns in various ecosystems around the world, and the imminent crossing of tipping points, and because we're not seeing a slowdown in fossil fuel extraction, with notable exceptions such as Colombia, maybe the primary one, but rather a speed up, global climate politics is being pushed in other directions than originally conceived mitigation. So there is more focus on adaptation, but particularly on carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering. Solar geoengineering is the idea that we should reduce global warming not by cutting emissions, but by blocking incoming sunlight. I don't think I've ever lectured with a noise level like this. Yeah. And the most commonly conceived technology then would be to shoot airplanes into the sky and inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere and create a kind of shield that intercepts some of the insolation, some of the incoming sunlight, and thereby cool down the Earth. And what we've seen in just the past year is a rapid uptick in the experiments in this kind of technology. The first important one being undertaken by an Israeli company called Stardust Solutions, which about a year ago, the genocide, of course, being ongoing on the ground in Gaza, sent fighter jets into the stratosphere and injected sulfate aerosols into it to study what can be done. The British government, you know, the homeland of the fossil economy, of fossil capital, just announced that it is green-lighting experiments of this kind in the very near future. And these are just a couple of examples of the rush to explore this technology. This comes with very significant dangers. It's a technology that is being primarily promoted by interests in the global north. And I think it is very important for countries in the global south, this one included, to prepare for a scenario, because it's already happening, where northern countries are pushing for this as a kind of techno fix to the problem of uncontrollable global warming. And the general view of these things is that if there is any country that is going to do solar geoengineering, it's going to be the United States, because it has to be the most powerful country in the world that does this. And like I said, this comes with tremendous dangers. And I urge people in Colombia and elsewhere generally to engage with this and prepare for it, because it's becoming more and more likely. Now, in this period of overshoot that we're in, so we're overshooting 1.5 degrees. We might soon be overshooting 2 degrees as well. There's only one kind of politics that can potentially save significant parts of the world in a habitable shape. And that is a politics for leaving fossil fuels in the ground and not setting them on fire. This makes it extremely important to have countries in the world that actually try to do precisely this. So it follows that what you've been trying to do here over the past few years is of incredible importance for the world as a whole. And I very much hope that this experiment survives the elections that you're having next year, and that we don't get a fossil fuel frenzy here, like in the United States, with you know, an opening to unlimited fracking, for instance, which seems to me a potentially disastrous scenario for this country and for the world more generally. So yeah, I guess I'll end there.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you so much. We would like to know right now if anyone has any questions to pose. Okay, there are some professors from the university. If you have any questions, please, you can open your mic and pose a question. Any questions you may like that you would like to ask, Andres? Andres, can you hear me? My name is Jorge Argenta. I am an official and in the Ministry of Environment, I call Corpus Cesar is the entity in the department of El Cesar in relation to the topic today is in charge of the issuance of licensing of the environment for non-conventional energy among other projects. And this is the first photovoltaic project in Colombia. He's way too far from the microphone. In Colombia, this is the first photovoltaic project. My specific question, and I have asked this myself a lot, and I would like to have some answers. I agree with Andreas when he mentions that we must boost or leverage these renewables. But I believe that there must be some kind of balance between the leverage of the non-conventional sources and the historically mentioned fossil fuels. But the question is, do you know any experiences or estimates that may allow or that may affirm that by substituting, or perhaps if we, is there the possibility to substitute or to replace fully with renewables? Because, we can we replace fully these renewables? Because as you know, fossil fuels and hydroelectric power also moves the economy of the country. We know that they are not permanent. So there's a reflection that I've been doing in the course of time with this environmental licensing, with this type of projects. When we are delivered, okay, an X company says, okay, we must install a project of 70 megawatts. We need 70 megawatts to be able to build. We have to remove a great deal of forest. Isn't this like a countersense that we must eliminate natural resources to install these facilities that is going to last for 20, 30 years, perhaps? So isn't this like a countersense? The IPCC report actually drives both things, that we should develop this type of projects. But I don't know if the question is clear. I'm sorry, he's way away from the microphone. I can't hear him very well. How much area, for instance, we need for solar panels for the energy of the country instead of doing these other type of projects? Thank you for your question. My name is Felipe Corral. Right now, I am the coordinator of the advocacy area of the strategy. of just transitions. But I used to perform as advisor of the Ministry of Energy, and I work with Joanna, where we worked together in just transition. And about the question of my colleague, indeed, that was one of the main questions that we tried to answer. And this is as from the modeling of the energy systems, how can this be replaced somehow? These fossil fuels gradually in a country like Colombia. Now, the first part of the answer is Department of El Salvador exports 90% with a country of exporting country, oil exporting country of 50%. We're not talking about the energy, but we are actually talking about economic alternatives that will replace that value that contributes to the exports and the economy of Colombia. Well, then it is also a huge challenge because outside and inside the government, it is not simple, especially because this needs a great, huge investment. And going to that energy that is consumed in Colombia, diesel, gasoline, or coal that is used in the industries. The question is how we can start transitioning with different technologies on the one hand to a more efficient use of the energy, and on the other hand to make to slow down or phase out this energy. If you have an internal combustion vehicle, well, the fuel or gasoline that you have in the tank, it uses the 20% and 80% is just inefficient loss. If you now move or make a transition to an electric car, you have a 90% of efficiency, and you're going to have the same motion. And the same happen with the industries, the pumps, and the different technologies that allow to electrify the processes and use energy in a much more efficient way. So as you can see, as it is happening in Bogota with the buses, there are many electric buses, but we need more electricity. That's where we have the drama about the calculations of how much energy do we need for this purpose, and the results that we had in this scenario, which was very ambitious in the transition. It indicated that we needed to move from 21 kilowatts of the capacity of electricity right now. Sorry. From 21 gigawatts of capacity of electricity generation, we needed to reach between 90 and 91 gigawatts. And mostly comes from solar energy. But that's where this interesting opportunity about solar energy. You can have these soils. These are very extensive from the Atlantic. You need 60,000 hectares for 60 gigawatts. But we must take into account other type of comparisons. Only the concession represents more than the area that we need for solar energy. But for solar energy, we don't need necessarily the soil. As you can see, we've seen that the solar energies in the different stores, for instance, they wanted to have the solar panels around them. So that we can have a great magnitude. They do not need only the logic that they have to use the soil. but they're going to keep needing in certain sectors for certain processes some fossil fuels. But the key here is that it is not going to be in the magnitude that we already know and in the sectors that we have seen. And this is going to allow us to reduce considerably as from this energy efficiency, the energy consumption, and at the same time, we increase the useful effort from that energy. These can be of mobility processes, among others. So I would like to invite you all to read these documents and the calculations that are on the website of the Ministry of Energy. And there are some complementary exercises in this energy sector. And we have tried to model in detail and to provide support in this analysis about the territory in terms of just transition. Any further questions or reply to it, perhaps? Thank you. According to what Felipe has mentioned, they can establish what's the best site to leverage this, because when the projects are proposed, the companies, when they talk about these wind energy projects, they want for these to be very close to the facilities of these factories, and they say that this is less profitable for them. What they seek is for these wind energy parks to be around 6-7 kilometers away, 10 kilometers tops. So that moderation, they always wonder what's going to be the best place to place their factories. They needed, for this project, they needed to intervene in the forest to create these 60 megawatt project. So sometimes these projects become not viable. So we have to negotiate, and we allow them to leverage some part of this ecosystem. And at some point, we tell them, okay, you need have these superficial currents. But they accepted also the construction and they extended. And this was like 80 meters width, wide. But of course, we should not intervene in these protected areas. And of course, there are some limitations, and they just feel that these projects are not have some kind of blockages. I think that these type of things should be published so that we avoid the elimination of a great mass of forest. And on the other hand, maybe we can replace where they can, maybe they can develop other activities like mining. Right now, it's not being done, but this can happen. So we must find sites that could be close to the substations and just not to say, okay, this site you are not going to be able to use for anything. Well, the first thing that we must say there is that work that you've been doing to defend that the ecological integrity, in this case at subnational level, is essential because we cannot sacrifice those environmental values in favor of energies that perhaps certain advantages, but has also disadvantages on the other hand. So this is the first issue that we must recognize first and foremost, and to recognize your big work, your great job, and about the potential. I'm going to give the floor to my colleague Joanna, who's working on this, but I would like for you to reflect upon the fact that in a tropical country like Colombia, like Germany, Canada, which is vulnerable, the total of the country has enough potential for solar power so that our project, especially those close to the sources of consumption, uh, can be closed. I think that in the use of soil, of course, there are many soil that has been degraded or that have already been intervened, and we must not impact once again. But on the other hand, to reuse. For instance, if we think about the landfills of the mines, it doesn't make it easy to do some ecological restoration, or perhaps we can think about the parking lots. An idea that has been happening globally, for instance, in France, all the parking laws or these parking places can be covered with solar panels, and in some cases in the massive public transportation, like in Bogota, there are some parts of dozens of hectares that can be intended for that. But for the potential issue, and I will give the floor to my colleague Joanna, who has done a lot of work on this issue. Good morning, everyone. To tell you just three things very briefly. Firstly, we made a research per regions of the solar, wind potential, as well as other renewables, and it's contained in the documents mentioned by Felipe. And for the energy transition, we also take into account the mission energy and the government with all its big solutions. In the case of OMS, they have to assign the points of connection to the transmission network. During this government, we have had the great number of points of connection, around 20 gigawatts were assigned, and we as the governmental entity that assigned those points of connection, our task is to determine within the transmission network where we are going to install all those points. However, the decision of where is this going to be installed, it is up to the government. No one, because of the current regulation, will know, in addition to the promoter, where this project is going to take place. It is the one developing the project that decides. That's why it's fundamental that when we do this just energy transition, and together with the environment and the realities of the territories, this is a joint work and effort that we must do, and this is fundamental. And at governmental level, we see what happens when there is a overlap of different projects, what is being worked through the ministry. But very briefly to say that the government has no answer, because nowadays the one who makes the decision is the market itself. Otherwise, there will be many other positions, but currently, this decision is made by the market. Only by assigning the points of connection to the transmission network, because transmission is planned and is executed through the national government through the different planning elements. So I think that is also important to clear up so that we can have this discussion in depth. And this is where the Popular Union must have a very strong position to defend their territories, all the authorities of the government and other people. Of course, we have to make the just transition without a doubt. Any further questions? Well, 3 more questions. Please try to make very short questions. And here, so that this can be translated to Andreas. Good morning. My name is Tony Hernandez. I work in an environmental and health program. My question is about the just transition within the Department of SSR. This department has an economic matrix of non-consumption. Our matrix is of economic production. And the economic production depends on that, depend 90%, I would say over 90%, because the entire development of the department depends on the royalties generated by those projects. So internally in the department, and for the generation of our economy, our department depends a lot on these royalties. The project that is financed, the department needs those royalties. Question is a problem is that we must take this so that this transition is seen only from the consumption standpoint. But this, and also the consumption comes from hydroelectric power, 70% of it. So we need the transition, but economically speaking, the economic business of our country is to depend on instruction, and our department is sent, so it's greater. So my question is, if the economy depends on those instructions and the economic matrix, or what is projected, and that the war comes because of the consumption on instruction. So how are we going to balance all those processes when the transition of the green energies does not allow to create those large scale projects that will meet the needs and that keep increasing those needs of energy consumption? In the end, we are not going to have a balance of the consumption to what needs to be met worldwide, because the trend is to increase the energy consumption worldwide, to increase that energy consumption. So we are underneath this. We're not underneath. The trend is to increase the consumption. Now, Colombia has another problem, and that is that in the rural areas that has to be connected, there's still no interconnection yet. To increase the quality of life, you must connect. So my question is, within that modeling, that we must take into account all those rural areas that have no energy or electricity, and that we need to provide, because we need to improve the life conditions. The energy consumption is also related to health, and we must change the consumption. For instance, here in Colombia, if we turn to solar energy in order to improve the quality of life in the rural areas, which is quite low in our country, and this also increase the matrix. So I would like to understand if the modeling is taking into account that process, and also to be aware of the policy of decarbonization, because this process of decarbonization can slow down this other process. All these royalties increase, how is going to, how the transition is going to look like. So I would like to understand how they've done that. I'm so sorry to stop you because it's really good to listen to different ideas, but we have two more questions on hold. Andres? Also, you were invited up to 9 a.m. Would you like to continue? Because we have two more interventions. Should we continue or not? Well, as they think there are three answers. The first one, how do we replace the royalties if we do a transition? Well, we are going to switch to the question of how are we going to use the royalties to make the transition? We depend on experts. Currently, what should we do? One of the bets is to create industry. We can do, for instance, factories of solar panels, and also to go to the origins, and each one of the departments in the regions have. So the model is change, which comes from traditional extractivist and from producing raw materials to become more industrial. To say, okay, I'm not going to sell the raw material, but I'm going to produce something that adds value. And this is a bet that we should do as a country. Secondly, did they take into account? Yes, they took into account within the modeling of the scenarios. Clearly, we must identify that this is not only a modeling of the scenarios. This is done nationwide, but you are going to find 10 documents on this. There are two about the economic matrix and how to do the energy transition through the industrialization of our country. So how do we do this industrialization and avoid emissions? We must have industry that is friendly to the environment or environmentally friendly, and to build industries that do not depend on fossil fuels, but instead of other technologies that are already available in the market that are more efficient than allow us to produce. Now, the main strategy to phase out the to slow down the emissions and phase out the fossil fuels is to think in the renewable energies. There are the technologies are right there, but we must develop these and develop each one of the regions with the capital and the entire potential that it has. And the last question that you posed was, this was related to the increase of coverage of electricity in the rural areas. Well, we're working in the ministries and different units of the government. Of course, they are all involved because some of them can transition from diesel consumption to other types of energy. And these are different problems, of course, but they are part of our reality when the energy transition model is to identify the social realities of our country. They also talk about the impacts and the coverage. And if you see the potential that Colombia has right now to be able to develop maybe the entire Colombia with the different technologies, we would be able to provide energy and do the transition. It's easy? No. It's a process? Yes. So we must, the former minister, Susana Dipo, she said, okay, there's money, there's the capital. What do we need? The capacity to make this real. It's just like a soccer. We have the entire team, but we don't have the ball. We must come together in order to provide these business models. We need capital funds that can be invested. But the thing is, how do we materialize those projects and to make them to make them close this equation. But there is the capital. But the thing is, okay, we should change the mindset and say, no, well, we need actually coal. Why? If there, this has changed. So if we need to change the mindset, then we are going to move forward. Thank you. I would like to ask for the last time for Andreas in regard to his topic. As I said, there's another presentation. So if you have any questions to Andreas, and this puts on the table the interest and the need to opening spaces about this topic, and that's wonderful. But right now, please, any questions about Andreas' conference? Further questions? Okay, we are going to close this part because the interpretation is leaving. Interpreter is leaving. Okay. Mi nombre es Iván Rafael. I am from the Department of Exercise Sociologist, and I'm part of the civil society organization. The very concrete question is, the energy transition scenario in El Cesar entails big challenges in governance matters. This is something that occurs elsewhere. But we also conclude in something, and that is an eternal and natural pressure of nature, and that El Cesar is not going to stop being a mining department, and we have a coal mining. It's very much likely that we're not going to stop that extraction of in the mine and the coal mines, and this is necessary for the energy. But so my question is, how do we accomplish to institutionalize the lessons learned that the extraction of coal within the department? That is, how do we institutionalize the lessons learned in environmental, social, and economic matters? Thank you. Okay, we are going to close here. I would like for you to talk a little bit about the relationship, about work extraction of fossil fuels, and rationalizing how these rationalizing processes and the exploitation of the workers. We can think about a transition how do we have these processes of hiring workers in the energy transition sector? How can we think about these processes, hiring processes? Or labor?
So the question was how to think about retraining workers.
First, in the lessons that we have from other processes, historical processes, in the relationship between racialization and labor. And then
Racialization and labor.
And then how can
yes, rationalization. Yes.
Like what the lessons and the process of energy transition.
Okay.
Other conference.
Huh?
Other conference.
Should I use the open? Yeah. I'm I'm not entirely sure I understand you. You're thinking about the link between racialization and the transition. Oh wait, can you give some more concrete examples?
That are people often don't talk about race.
Yeah.
In the processes. So resource extraction, how is embedded race and classes are embedded in the extraction codes, for instance.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how we can, like the lessons from other parts of the world,
Yeah.
in thinking about those variables, and then how like race and class play a role.
Okay. That useful? Okay, so I'm a little bit uncertain about how to respond to this question, but what is very clear is that the politics of race is central to much of what's going on in the global north when it comes to defending fossil capital and obstructing a transition and extending the life of the fossil economy. So what, like I said, what we're seeing in much of the global north is a reactionary reinforcement of the power of fossil fuel companies. And this very often or almost always goes hand in hand with the defense of white supremacy. So I wrote a book together with the Zetkin Collective called White Skin, Black Fuel on the Dangers of Fossil Fascism, which exists in a Spanish translation as well, where we study the links, the articulations between racism and fossil fuels in certain European countries and the US and Brazil. And since we wrote that book, unfortunately, I mean, if you compare it to the situation right now, it's considerably worse, where in countries like the US and Germany, notably recently, you've had elections where extreme hostility to immigration, to the presence of non-white people, is fused with extreme hostility to climate politics and the defense of fossil fuels. The AfD is the German embodiment of this fusion in its most extreme form, but you see it on this in the CDU, the conservative right as well. And of course, in the US, you have Trump personifying it. So, you know, I don't know how the politics of race really works in this country. Because like I said, I mean, this is my first trip here. I've only been here for what is now 10 days or something like that. But in the global north, any kind of progress in climate politics implies or presupposes victory over a far right that is fundamentally animated by racist politics against, you know, the presence of non-white people, immigration, and things like this. And also wedded to climate denial. I mean, apparently this is not a phenomenon in this country, but in much of Europe and obviously in the US, the far right still denies that the climate problem exists whatsoever. You know, there have been for a long time, these predictions that the climate denial will go out of fashion. It's untenable. So no one will continue to deny the existence of the climate crisis. But in fact, that's not the case. The AfD, now in the latest polls, the single largest party in Germany, is as committed to crude classical climate denial as ever. And the same with the Trump administration. I mean, the denial in the US now is so aggressive that, you know, the American government is actively trying to shut down climate research. And this is of a piece with politics of deporting unwanted non-white people to, you know, back here or to Honduras or whatever. And it's very much the similar situation in Europe. So I can't really speak to the politics of the racialization of labor in the transition away from fossil fuels because I don't really have any knowledge that would allow me to speak of it. But it's very clear in the global north that if we're ever going to have any kind of energy transition, this can only happen if the far right is out of power. Unfortunately, the situation now from the US to Germany is that the far right is just gaining more and more power and becoming more and more insane and aggressive all the time.
Thank you. Bueno, muchas gracias, Andreas. De esta manera, entonces, cerramos esta conferencia que básicamente fue una...
Thank you, Andreas. We close now this conference.
Queda pendiente la suya, pero bueno, con la otra presentación. A continuación, Andrés Gómez, que es el coordinador del Tratado de No Proliferación de Combustibles
Is the coordinator of the
the
fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty.
Buenos días, muchas gracias por su asistencia, por esperar todo este tiempo. Fundamentalmente queremos complementar y también
Fundamentally, we must complement and
pensando en la necesidad de cesar de transitar en esta
the need to make this just transition.
necesidad de
In this need
pensar en una transición
of thinking about a transition when the markets are the ones forcing Colombia and El Cesar beyond the policies that we might take from this phase out of fossil fuels. So the next, clearly science tells us that we must leave the fossil fuels underground. These are 2018 numbers that states that 89% of coal. Let's talk specifically about coal here in SSR. Servers by 2018, 90% of them should stay underground. What does this mean? What does this mean?
Andrés. Okay.
Yeah.
90%, 90% del carbón.
89% of coal must stay underground, and 58% in oil and 59% in gas. Next slide. The other thing that we see clearly is that as we have to phase out the hydrocarbons and to create energy as from fossil fuels and going through the green path, as we see on the slide, what the oil companies are doing is to keep it business as usual and to increase more exploration and production of fossil fuels, contrary to science, what science states. And there's another phenomenon that Andreas spoke about, and this that as renewable energies are stepping in the world trend, we see that by 2021, they keep almost 80% of the use in the energy mix of fossil fuels still, which means that we are increasing the energy consumption, but we are doing this as from renewables by creating a better electricity offer, but we're not replacing fossil fuels. And this is fundamental to understand how we should propose the new models of the use of energy that will replace fossil fuels and not to increase the availability of energy. Fundamentally, we must understand Colombia is not an oil producer country. We only have 0.5 of the proven reserves of oil and less than 0.05% of the gas reserves, which means that gas is not transitioned, that an alternative for necessary is not gas. Therefore, what we need to think is on how we are going to step out of these fossil fuel dependence that science shows, and especially the biology of the country and the geology of the country, that geology that is telling us we have no oil, we have no gas, but we have conditions to have the renewable resources. And fundamentally, we are not an oil country, but we are a mega diverse country where life and the culture of life must be in the core, in the center. Here we are seeing how the largest oil fields around the world of oil and gas were found in the previous years. Only 5 oil fields extract 10% of the total of oil. The world consumption is 100 million barrels, and only from five oil fields found before 1970, they extract 10% of the oil. What does this mean? That the cheapest oil fields where they get the cheapest oil have already been found, and we are not going to find any other type of oil fields of this kind. And the same thing is happening in Colombia. If you see on this graph in 1918, that's when they found the largest oil field, Calcas. And from that point forward, we've seen only oil fields that are marginal, and that is the reality. Even if we invest much more money into exploration, we are not an oil country, as numbers show. The same thing with gas. We found in 1972 the largest gas field in Chuchupa. After that, we have not had any larger discoveries. And what the science is saying is that there's no gas in Colombia. The gas that we have in Colombia is extremely expensive and under different conditions. This graph, it is very important to see, because we've been talking a long time for fracking, how fracking could be an alternative for the country. You can see this interesting slide. Destruction of the production of Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States. You check this on the left. If you see on the left, basically what it says is it tells us that we have the same production in all three countries. I'm sorry. While the production is about the same in all three countries, we see that the drilled wells in the different countries is completely different. In Saudi Arabia, that same amount of oil, which is on 10 million barrels, they extract only 400 wells. The same quantity in Russia is 1,500 wells, but in the US, that same quantity is extracted from 35,000 wells. It means that there is a great intensity of carbon dioxide in the hydrocarbons extracted in the US and through the fracking, which is fundamentally the technique that is being used there. And what is this telling us? That it is much more expensive to take oil and gas in the United States than in Saudi Arabia. So we are going to have a condition that repeats in Colombia, because we have no way to extract cheap oil, but as from the fracking, and in addition to the territorial and environmental impacts that this entails. Now we're saying that the climate bet on Colombia brings an undesired effect. We have imported gas in the past 20 years, and we have a crisis that is linked or related to that amount of gas that we don't have, and we have all the conditions to replace this gas for renewable energies, for energy diversity, and the efforts of the communities to produce the same energy and to do the exchange related to the life project. Gas is not the pathway and no solution. And to understand as well, I would like to stop here, but this is the extracting sector that consumes gas the most. If we check these numbers, we extract over 600 million cubic meters in Colombia, but it is really strange, because we just market 1,000. What happens with the rest? This is consumed by the fossil fuel industry. They buried it to keep extracting oil. So what do we have here? We must see that when they say that gas is going to be depleted, how are we going to cook? Well, it's not necessary that this is not important for those promoting the extraction of more gas. As we can see, the greatest part of gas is used in thermoelectrical stations. These can be replaced by renewables, and we've said that already. And what the oil industry is doing is to consume more gas. We have a few core elements that I have summarized. Colombia is not an oil country, and the exploration in Colombia of oil and gas does not work. And only we have 10 oil fields. We take 50% of the oil from gas, so we extract 4% of gas, which means that what is the market showing? Is showing the logics of the country that we must step out from and phase out from oil, gas, and coal as soon as possible. And I will stop there.